Hey, you're listening to Night Tide. Tonight I'll walk you through one of the oldest and most quietly urgent questions in philosophy: what dignity is, and what it means that people call it something that can never be taken away. That claim is everywhere. It's written into laws, into declarations, into the way we speak about one another. And yet, the feeling of having your dignity violated is one of the most common human experiences there is. So the question opens immediately. If dignity truly cannot be removed, what exactly is it that people lose when it is? Write in the comments what time it is for you right now, or how your day went. There are genuinely warm and thoughtful people in the Night Tide comments, and reading what you share is one of the real pleasures of this. If you'd like to support the Night Tide project, there's a link in the description. The word dignity carries a weight that most words don't survive for long. It has been used to justify revolutions and to block them. It appears in hospital ethics committees and in constitutional courts, and in the quiet interior of a person deciding whether to stay in a room where they are being humiliated. It is invoked constantly. And yet, when you press on it, when you ask what it actually is, where it comes from, what grounds the claim that it belongs to every person without exception, the certainty begins to soften almost immediately. That softening is not a failure. It is the beginning of an honest encounter with the concept. There are at least two entirely different things that get called dignity. The first is a metaphysical status, something that belongs to a person simply by virtue of being a person, prior to anything they have done or experienced, independent of whether anyone else acknowledges it. On this reading, dignity is unconditional and cannot be forfeited. It is there in the person who is celebrated and in the person who is despised. It persists through suffering, through failure, through being invisible to the world. The second thing called dignity is relational. It is a quality that emerges between people, something that can be extended or withheld, granted through recognition or damaged through disregard. On this reading, dignity is vulnerable, not because it is fragile by nature, but because it depends, at least partially, on conditions outside the person's control. Most arguments about dignity, philosophical arguments, legal arguments, arguments that happen in silence between two people in a difficult room, are actually arguments about which of these is real. And the reason those arguments never fully resolve is that both feel true. The metaphysical version feels true because there is something genuinely monstrous about the claim that dignity can be destroyed by what others do to you. It places too much power in the wrong hands. The relational version feels true because the experience of being stripped of dignity is real, is reported across cultures and centuries, and leaves marks. You cannot simply tell someone who has been humiliated that their dignity was never touched and expect that to land as comfort. So the concept holds two things in tension, and it has been doing this for a long time. What shifts across history, and the shift matters, is which version gets the emphasis and who is considered to have dignity at all. The assumption that dignity belongs to every human being equally is modern. It feels ancient because it has been absorbed so thoroughly into the language of rights and law. But in most of the philosophical and political history that preceded the last few centuries, dignity was a marker of distinction, not universality. It attached to rank, to office, to birth. A person of high dignity was a person set apart, elevated, entitled to particular treatment, visible in a particular way. The Latin dignitas carried this meaning almost entirely. It was not a gift distributed equally at birth. It was a position, earned or inherited, and it could be lost. The move that changed everything was the claim that every person, regardless of rank, capacity, achievement, or social standing, carries this status. That claim was not a recovery of something always quietly known. It was a rupture, and the work of making it philosophically rigorous, of explaining what grounds it and why it should be believed, has occupied serious thinkers ever since. The work is not finished. The declaration came before the argument that could support it, and in some important ways, the argument is still catching up. Two things called dignity. That is where we are. And the problem is not that we have failed to choose between them, it is that both descriptions are pointing at something real, and they are not pointing at the same thing. The metaphysical version says that dignity is a status. It belongs to you the way your existence belongs to you, prior to any action, any recognition, any social arrangement. It is not given by a government or a community or a parent. It is not contingent on your being seen or heard or treated well. It simply is, underneath everything that happens to you and everything that is done to you. This is the version that makes dignity sound like bedrock. The relational version says something different. It says that dignity is what happens in the space between people, that it is constituted, at least in part, by how one person treats another, how a society arranges its institutions, whether a system of power bothers to acknowledge the full personhood of those within it. On this reading, dignity is real, and it can be damaged. The person who has been degraded has had something taken, not just from their feelings, but from the structure of their standing in the world. These two versions have different consequences at almost every point where it matters. If dignity is metaphysical and unconditional, then no act of cruelty, no structure of oppression, no sustained campaign of humiliation can actually reach it. The person survives intact at some level that nothing external can touch. That is a profound claim, and it can sustain a person through conditions that would otherwise be unbearable. It can also be misused, deployed to suggest that what is being done to someone does not ultimately matter because their dignity is secure at a deeper level. The person endures, therefore the endurance is acceptable.
If dignity is relational, the exposure runs the other way. It means that dignity requires conditions to be real in a person's life. It means that institutions, relationships, and social arrangements are not merely backdrop to dignity, they are partially constitutive of it. Strip those conditions away, and you strip something genuine. The person is not merely inconvenienced or offended. Something has been damaged that belongs to them. What neither version can do alone is account for the full weight of what we actually mean when we use the word. The metaphysical version cannot fully explain why humiliation leaves the traces it does, why a person who has been systematically stripped of their standing in the world does not simply recall their unconditional status and recover. The relational version cannot fully explain why there is something monstrous, not just impolite or unjust, but monstrous, about treating a person as if their dignity does not exist. The monstrousness points at something that transcends the social arrangement, something that was already there before the violation occurred. So the concept is holding these two things simultaneously, and it has been doing that for a long time without resolving the tension. Philosophers have not missed this. The tension is not an oversight in the literature, it is the central problem. What grounds the unconditional version? Where does it live, if not in the recognition of others? And what does the relational version actually protect, if the thing being protected is not already there prior to any relationship? One way to feel the weight of this is to notice what happens when someone is treated as if their metaphysical status does not exist. The response is not simply disapproval of bad social behavior. Something in us registers a violation of a different order. The person doing the treating has not merely been rude, they have acted as if something were not there that is. That reaction, the sense of a specific kind of wrongness, suggests we do believe in something unconditional. And yet, the fact that the violation lands, that it does damage, that the person treated this way is genuinely worse off, points equally toward the relational account. A person raised in conditions where their personhood was never reflected back to them, where needs were treated as impositions, where their presence registered as inconvenience, does not typically walk through life in confident possession of their unconditional status. They carry the absence of recognition in how they move, what they expect, what they believe they are permitted to want. The metaphysical dignity is, in some sense, still there, and yet the practical force of it has been suppressed so thoroughly that the difference between having it and not having it, in terms of how a life is actually lived, can be almost impossible to locate. That gap between possessing dignity as a philosophical given and inhabiting it as a living fact is where the concept becomes most demanding, because it means the question of dignity is not settled by declaring it universal. Universality is the starting point, not the conclusion. What it leaves open is everything that follows. What conditions allow a person to actually live in accordance with the status they unconditionally possess, and what happens when those conditions are absent for years or decades or a whole life?
The whole history of dignity as a concept is, in one sense, the effort to hold both versions without letting either one collapse into the other. The inherent status without the relational dimension becomes an abstraction that can be used to justify leaving people in conditions that corrode them. The relational dimension, without the unconditional status, becomes something that can be granted and revoked, which means it was never dignity in the first place, only a kind of permission that the powerful extend to the powerless at their discretion. Neither collapse is acceptable, and that is exactly why the collision between the two meanings has never been definitively settled, and why every serious encounter with this concept eventually arrives at the same unresolved edge. The word dignitas, in its original Latin, had almost nothing to do with equality. It referred to weight, the particular gravity that attached to a person of standing, the quality that made a senator's presence different from a laborer's in the same room. The word did not describe something shared, it described something that separated. A man of dignitas was a man who had earned or been born into a position that commanded a particular kind of regard. To speak of his dignity was to acknowledge a social fact, not to make a claim about his inner life or his metaphysical status. This is not a footnote. It is the starting point for understanding how strange the modern claim actually is. When contemporary documents declare that every human being possesses dignity equally, they are not recovering an ancient truth that was always there beneath the surface. They are making a claim that would have been genuinely incomprehensible, and in some quarters genuinely offensive, to most of the societies that came before. The universality of dignity is not the baseline from which history deviated. For most of human thought on the subject, the opposite structure was assumed as natural. Dignity was differential, hierarchical, attached to position and rank and recognition from a community that knew how to assign those things. So the revolution happened, and it happened relatively recently, philosophically speaking, in the past few centuries, with its clearest articulation arriving in the Enlightenment and its political weight gathering through the upheavals of the 18th and 19th centuries, then being pressed into international legal language after the catastrophes of the 20th. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, opens with the word dignity, as if the concept had always been understood this way. It had not. The declaration was not a summary of consensus.
It was a wager on a new kind of claim.
The question is, what grounds that claim? If dignity no longer derives from rank, from birth, from office, if it does not come from community recognition, which can always be withdrawn, then where does it come from? Something has to bear the weight of universality. Some quality or property or status has to be present in every person without exception, not contingent on achievement or capacity or social arrangement. And the difficulty is that the more carefully you try to name that quality, the more it either excludes someone it was supposed to include or becomes so abstract that it stops doing real explanatory work. The capacity for reason has been the most prominent candidate. The Kantian version of dignity grounds it in rationality, in the ability to set ends for oneself, to act according to principles, to be the kind of being for whom reasons are relevant. This was meant to be universal among persons, which is why it supported the universality of dignity. The problem is that rationality, pressed as a criterion, begins to draw lines. Infants are not fully rational. People with severe cognitive impairments may not meet the technical standard. The elderly with advanced dementia are still persons to whom we feel the full weight of the dignity claim applies, and yet the rationality grounding struggles to explain why. The moment you notice this difficulty, you are already inside the problem that has occupied the concept for centuries. Every attempt to ground universal dignity on some specific property of persons faces the same pressure at its edges. If the grounding property admits of degrees, then dignity admits of degrees, which most people find morally unacceptable. If the grounding property is defined broadly enough to include everyone, it becomes difficult to say what exactly it is picking out or why it matters. There is a different way the claim has been approached, one less interested in identifying a property and more interested in the moral demand itself. On this view, what matters is not what we can demonstrate persons have, but what the alternative costs. If we allow that some persons possess less dignity than others, or that dignity can be graded by capacity or achievement, we have introduced a principle that has historically been used to justify every form of systematic degradation. The universality of dignity functions, on this reading, as a protective threshold, not a description of something we have proven, but a commitment we have made because we have seen what happens when we do not make it. This is an honest account, and it is philosophically uncomfortable, because it means the universality of dignity is not fully grounded in the way a mathematical proof is grounded. It is partly a response to history, a decision made in the shadow of what human societies have done when they allowed differential dignity to operate as policy. That decision has enormous moral force. The fact that it arrived through horror rather than through proof does not make it wrong. It does mean that the argument rests on something more fragile than pure reason and more durable than fashion. The absorption problem is distinct from the grounding problem, and in some ways harder. Even granting the universality claim, granting that every person carries this status without exception, the claim has not yet been absorbed at the level of actual perception and practice. There is a persistent gap between what societies have declared and how people actually register one another. The legal architecture of dignity is extensive. Constitutions in dozens of countries name it. International law treats it as foundational. And yet the felt sense of another person's full status, the immediate, unmediated recognition of the specific weight that belongs to the person in front of you, is not automatically generated by legal declarations. It has to be cultivated, practiced, in many cases actively worked against the grain of what various cultural and psychological forces are producing. This is what makes the revolution unfinished. The declaration came first. The philosophical argument to support it is still being developed, still contested at its foundations.
and the perceptual and moral transformation that would make the declaration feel as obvious as it sounds, that is slower still. You can write the word into law and still find that the law coexists in the same person, in the same institution, with habits of perception that organize the world along exactly the old lines: rank, visibility, usefulness, proximity.
The ancient meaning of dignitas never disappeared. It migrated. It attached to new markers: wealth, fame, productivity, social legibility. And it continued to distribute regard differentially, often without acknowledgement that this is what was happening. When someone is treated as if their presence is an inconvenience, as if their distress is not worth attention, as if the choices they make about their own life are available for override, the logic operating underneath that treatment is not so different from the logic of the old hierarchy. It does not call itself dignitas. It does not use the word at all, but the structure is recognizable. The philosophical revolution that declared dignity universal has not resolved this. What it has done is created a tension that can be held, argued from, returned to. The gap between the declaration and the reality is not a sign that the declaration was premature. It is the space where the work of the concept lives. Every serious argument about how persons should be treated is conducted in that space, between what has been declared unconditional and what is still, at the level of perception and practice, being earned or withheld. What the revolution accomplished was the creation of a standard that can be used as a lever. Because once universality is declared, once it is written down, argued for, legally embedded, any deviation from it becomes nameable as a deviation. That is not nothing. It is, in fact, the condition under which political and moral progress becomes possible at all. The standard that cannot be fully met can still orient movement toward it. The claim that every person carries this status, even when the argument beneath the claim is still unfinished, is still doing real work in the world. The unfinished argument does not make the claim weaker, it makes it honest. And it leaves open the question that the concept keeps generating at every level. Whether what we mean by universal dignity is something we have discovered about persons or something we have decided to act as if is true. And whether, in the end, that distinction changes anything about what the concept demands of us. Immanuel Kant's argument about persons being ends in themselves has been repeated so many times in so many contexts that it has acquired the soft quality of common sense, a moral platitude that people nod toward without pausing to measure what it actually requires. That familiarity is a problem because the demand is not soft at all. It is one of the most structurally radical claims ever made about what a person is owed. The mechanism at the center of the argument is this: a rational being, a being capable of setting ends for itself, of acting according to reasons, of treating its own purposes as genuinely its own, cannot be used merely as an instrument for someone else's ends without something fundamental being violated. Not just violated in feeling, not just offended, but violated in the sense that the person's status has been denied. The word merely is doing precise work here. Kant was not saying that persons can never be used in any instrumental sense. A doctor treats a patient, an employer directs a worker, a teacher shapes a student. All of these involve one person being useful to another. What is prohibited is the merely, treating a person as if their own ends, their own rational purposes, their own status as a self-directing being are entirely beside the point. When a person becomes purely a means, their interiority invisible, their purposes irrelevant, their presence registered only as useful or inconvenient, that is the violation dignity points to. It sounds reasonable, even modest, when stated that way.
The trouble begins when you follow it out. A factory worker on a production line whose only relevant feature to the system employing them is their labor output, whose distress, whose purposes, whose life outside the line are organizational externalities, is being treated in exactly the way Kant's principle prohibits. A prison system designed around deterrence and containment, where the interiority of the person incarcerated is systematically irrelevant to every decision made about them, is built on the logic the principle forbids. An advertising system that spends enormous resources learning exactly how to manipulate a person's desires and decisions without their awareness or meaningful consent is instrumentalizing persons in a way that the Kantian account of dignity names as a structural violation, not a side effect, but the operating principle. These are not fringe cases. They describe arrangements that most functioning societies treat as unremarkable. That is what makes the philosophical demand so difficult to absorb. It does not point at the exceptional atrocity. It points at the texture of ordinary life in organized societies, at the economic structures, the legal architectures, the habits of institutional management that most people participate in and depend upon without registering as violations of anything. A soldier named Sergei, sent to the front not because his officers care what happens to him, but because he is a tactical unit, present in the calculation, absent as a person, is the most visible case. But the principle is not exhausted by military contexts or authoritarian ones. It operates wherever the question, what does this person actually want? What do they need? What kind of being are they? Is treated as structurally irrelevant to how they are handled. That question's absence is the absence of dignity in the Kantian sense. Not its philosophical destruction. On Kant's own terms, the rational status persists regardless of how it is treated, but its practical nullification.
This is the gap that makes the argument so uncomfortable to sit with. If treating persons merely as means is wrong, and if entire economies and political systems are organized around doing exactly that, then dignity is not an edge case. It is a systemic challenge. The reason Kant's formulation gets cited in medical ethics and human rights law and employment codes is that it has genuine purchase on situations where personhood is being ignored in organized, repeatable ways. But the cost of taking it fully seriously is a critique that most institutional life cannot absorb without structural transformation. What does the argument actually protect, then, when the structures it indicts remain largely intact? The question does not dissolve the principle, it applies pressure to it. Even when the prohibition cannot be enforced globally across all the arrangements it names, it functions as a standard, a way of identifying what has gone wrong when something goes wrong, and why the wrongness is not merely a matter of preference or efficiency. When a person is treated as if their own ends do not exist, the principle gives a name to what has been violated. Not just a rule, but a status. Not just a guideline, but a claim that was already there. There is something worth noticing in the specific shape of the violation Kant describes. It is not about pain. A person can be treated merely as a means in conditions of physical comfort, with every material need met. The violation is epistemic and structural. It is about whether the person's rational nature is acknowledged at all as a fact that matters to how they are treated. This is why dignity in the Kantian account cannot be reduced to welfare. A person whose welfare is fully managed, but whose interiority is entirely disregarded, whose preferences are studied only to be more effectively overridden, whose purposes are treated as noise in the system, is being denied something that welfare metrics do not capture. The thing being denied is the recognition of a specific kind of being. The limits of the argument show up at its edges.
Rationality as the ground of dignity creates pressure cases immediately. What about human beings for whom the capacity Kant describes is not present in the standard form? Infants, people with profound cognitive differences, individuals in states where reasoning is temporarily or permanently inaccessible. These persons are still persons to whom we apply the full moral weight of dignity without hesitation. Yet the rationality criterion, pressed strictly, struggles to explain why. Kant's own framework had resources for extending the protection, but the extension requires additional argument, and the additional argument is contested. The difficulty is not a reason to abandon the principle. It is a reason to hold it with both hands, to take the demand seriously at every point where the logic does apply, while staying honest about where the grounding strains. Most philosophical work on dignity since Kant has been an attempt to do exactly that, to preserve the structural insight, that persons are not instruments, that their rational interiority imposes a limit on how they may be treated, while finding ways to extend the protection beyond the rationality criterion's natural reach.
What the argument leaves the listener with is not comfort.
It leaves you with a standard that, if taken seriously, changes the way you look at arrangements so familiar they have become invisible. That is what a genuine philosophical demand does. It does not fit neatly into the life you already have. It exerts pressure on it from the outside, from the level of what you actually are, and what that means for every system that handles you as if you were something less. There is something almost paradoxical in the experience of shame. The feeling announces itself as a collapse, something falling in, a sudden awareness of exposure, and it is easy to read that collapse as evidence that dignity has been damaged or removed. The natural assumption is that shame and dignity sit on opposite ends of a scale. More of one means less of the other. But the relationship is not so clean, and tracing it carefully changes what it means to speak about dignity as something permanent. What shame actually requires is a standard. To feel diminished is to have some sense of what undiminished looks like. A person who has no concept of their own worth, no felt sense that certain treatment is beneath what they should receive, cannot experience shame in the way we mean it. They might experience pain, confusion, fear. But shame has a specific structure. It is the recognition that something is wrong with how one is being treated, or how one has acted, measured against a standard that already exists inside the person doing the feeling. You cannot feel the gap if you have no sense of where you should be standing. This is the inversion worth sitting with. The capacity to feel shame is the capacity to recognize a standard of treatment one deserves. And that capacity, the ability to feel diminished, is itself evidence of the very thing that cannot be diminished. Dignity is not gone when shame arrives. Dignity is, in a specific and uncomfortable sense, the precondition for shame's existence at all. A being with no dignity, in the metaphysical sense, no status as a person to whom things are owed, would not be capable of shame. Animals experience something like distress, disorientation, submission behaviors. Whether they experience shame in the philosophically loaded sense depends on whether they carry that internal standard, that felt measurement of how they should be met by the world. The further down the question you press, the clearer the connection becomes. Shame presupposes a sense of one's own standing, and the sense of one's own standing is the interior form of what dignity names. This does not make shame pleasant or redemptive or something to be sought. The experience itself is often devastating. A child humiliated in front of others carries that event in the body, in the heat of the face, in the way the chest tightens, long after the moment has passed. The adult who is spoken to in a tone designed to communicate that their presence is an imposition, feels it as something physical, an actual shrinking. None of this should be minimized. But the devastation of those experiences is precisely because something real is being registered. A gap between treatment received and treatment deserved. That gap cannot be felt unless the standard exists. And the standard, wherever it lives, in early childhood formation, in relational transmission, in something harder to locate than either, does not disappear when someone tries to erase it through contempt.
So surviving humiliation does not mean dignity was absent during it. It may mean the opposite. The person who emerges from a sustained experience of degradation, still capable of recognizing that something wrong was done to them, still in possession of the knowledge that there was a standard being violated, has held something through conditions designed to make it impossible to hold. That is not a small thing. It is also not automatic. The damage is real, and the capacity to claim what was violated is not always available immediately afterward or for years. But the philosophical point stands behind the psychological difficulty. The trace of dignity visible in shame is the trace of something that was there all along. There is a complication, though, and it needs to be acknowledged rather than smoothed over. Not all shame connects to the standard in this straightforward way. Shame can also be installed, taught, weaponized, pointed at features of a person that have nothing to do with treatment owed or withheld. A person can be made to feel shame about their body, their origin, their desire, their language. And this kind of shame does not point toward a real violation of dignity at all. It points toward a successfully completed attack on a person's ability to inhabit their own standing. This is shame as a tool of degradation, rather than shame as evidence of dignity's presence. The distinction matters because it means shame is not a reliable signal in every direction. Sometimes it is exactly the evidence we have been discussing, the felt recognition of a gap between treatment received and treatment deserved. And sometimes it is a wound inflicted specifically to prevent a person from trusting that recognition. The person who has been taught to feel shame about what they are, their existence treated as something that should apologize for itself, is not receiving evidence of their dignity. They are experiencing one of the more effective mechanisms for suppressing dignity's practical force. The two are structurally different, but they can feel identical from the inside. What separates them is the direction the standard points. Real shame, in the sense the philosophical argument relies on, measures a gap between treatment and what is deserved. Weaponized shame redirects the measurement. Instead of pointing at the treatment, it points at the person, implying that the problem is what they are rather than how they have been handled. Recognizing the difference is one of the harder perceptual tasks a person can undertake, particularly when the installation of shame began early enough that the standard and the wound feel like the same thing. The connection between dignity and shame also casts a different light on the experience of surviving humiliation. If dignity was simply destroyed by a sufficiently brutal assault on it, the survivor's continued sense of violation would make no sense. What would there be to violate? The ache that persists, the anger that arrives later, sometimes much later, when a person is finally in conditions safe enough to feel it, is itself shaped by the standard that was never actually removed. The anger knows what the treatment should have been. That knowledge does not come from nowhere. It is the form dignity takes when the assault is over and the person begins to reconstruct their own standing. This is where the concept becomes genuinely demanding, in a direction that is easy to miss. If shame is evidence of dignity, and if dignity cannot be destroyed even by sustained degradation,
then the person who has been through that degradation is not working from nothing when they begin to reclaim what was suppressed. They are working from something that was always there, quieted perhaps for a long time, made practically inaccessible by the weight of what was done, but present. The task of recovering the ability to inhabit dignity is not the task of building something from scratch. It is the task of returning to something that waited. The Stoic position on dignity arrives looking like freedom. Marcus Aurelius, writing in the 2nd century, alone at the edge of empire, conducting a private argument with himself, returned again and again to the same observation. What is truly mine cannot be taken from me, because what is truly mine is not my circumstances, but my judgment, my response, my capacity to meet whatever comes with a quality of attention that no external force can reach. The slave Epictetus had said the same thing from a different position entirely, from the experience of actual bondage. And the fact that both arrived at the same formulation is worth pausing over. The emperor and the slave held the same interior structure. Whatever separated them on every external axis, something that both called dignity, resided in neither the palace nor the chains. That is a genuinely powerful claim. It is also where the danger begins. The Stoic insight is that dignity is interior, seated in the reasoning faculty, in the will, in the capacity to orient oneself toward what is good, regardless of what one's body or social position or material conditions happen to be. On this account, no one can strip you of your dignity, because they cannot reach the place where it lives. A person publicly humiliated retains their dignity if they retain their judgment. A person imprisoned unjustly retains their dignity if their response to the imprisonment is chosen rather than simply suffered. The violation lands on the surface, the center holds. There is something true in this, and the truth is not small. People have survived conditions of extraordinary brutality by inhabiting exactly this structure, by finding in the interior something that the brutality could not locate, and therefore could not destroy. Viktor Frankl's accounts from the camps describe something recognizable as precisely this Stoic mechanism, a last zone of freedom in the choosing of one's response to what cannot be changed. The philosophical tradition and the lived experience agree that the interior is real, that it is not fully accessible to external assault, and that something meaningful can persist there when everything else has been taken. So the liberating function of the Stoic position is genuine. And it is the next step that requires close attention. The same argument, dignity is interior, circumstances do not touch it, the wise person remains whole regardless of conditions, can be lifted from the context of personal survival and placed into a context of institutional justification. When it is placed there, it changes its meaning entirely without changing its words. The person who tells a worker that their dignity is internal and therefore unaffected by their wages is using Stoic language for a purpose Stoicism itself would find unrecognizable. The governing body that instructs a persecuted population to maintain their interior bearing while doing nothing about the conditions producing the persecution is exploiting the philosophical claim to insulate itself from responsibility. The logic sounds identical. The application inverts the original purpose. This is the specific danger, and it cannot be resolved by simply choosing one reading and discarding the other. What separates them is not the philosophical content, but the position from which the claim is being made, and for whose benefit. When Epictetus draws this conclusion from inside the experience of bondage, he is finding a resource for survival. When the argument is made from outside, pointing at someone else's suffering, It can function as a tool for tolerating what should be intolerable. There is a further complication. The Stoic position, taken fully, tends to reduce the moral relevance of external conditions to a person's dignity. If dignity is wholly interior and cannot be damaged by circumstances, then circumstances are less urgent as a site of moral concern. The focus shifts inward, toward the quality of one's response, the management of one's judgment, the cultivation of equanimity. These are genuine goods, but they can quietly displace the question of whether the circumstances themselves are unjust. A philosophy that teaches you to be undamaged by injustice, rather than to see the injustice as an urgent problem requiring address, has moved from a tool of survival into something that makes injustice easier to maintain. Marcus Aurelius, returning to this question repeatedly across the Meditations, never fully resolved it. He was, after all, an emperor with actual power over the conditions of other people's lives, and yet the philosophy he practiced was oriented almost entirely toward the management of his own interior state. The gap between the philosophical position and the political responsibility it implied was one he acknowledged obliquely without resolving. This is not a criticism of Aurelius specifically. It is an observation about the structure of the position itself. It equips the person who holds it to endure, and says less about what they are required to do for others whose endurance is being demanded of them without their consent. The question this leaves you with is not whether the Stoic insight is false. It is whether a truth about interior dignity can be used as a reason to stop paying attention to exterior conditions. And the answer is that it can. Not because the philosophy intends this, but because philosophical claims do not control their own application once they enter social and political life. The claim that dignity cannot be destroyed by external events is genuinely useful when you are the person in those events, trying to hold something together. It becomes a different instrument entirely when someone outside the event uses it to explain why the event is not, finally, their problem. What persists as a genuine insight, once the dangerous application has been acknowledged, is the irreducibility of the interior dimension. Something is real there. The way a person meets their own experience, with a quality of attention, with the refusal to allow external pressure to become the whole of what they are, is not a fiction. It is not enough, because it does not change what is happening from the outside. But it is real, and it is worth protecting, and the Stoic tradition named it with unusual clarity. The problem is not the naming. The problem is what happens when the naming becomes an excuse for looking away from everything the interior, on its own, cannot fix.
Worth, honor, value, respect. The four words orbit dignity in almost every serious conversation about it, and they orbit so closely that the distinctions between them seem like pedantry. They are not. Each word names a structurally different relationship between a person and the world, and once you see the structure, you cannot unsee it. What is at stake is not semantic precision for its own sake. What is at stake is what dignity actually protects, and whether anything in the concept holds when you press it. Worth is comparative by nature. To assign worth to something is to place it somewhere on a scale relative to other things. A stone has worth measured against other stones. A contract has worth measured against what it can deliver. A worker's labor has worth measured against what the market will pay. Worth can increase or decrease. It responds to circumstance, to scarcity, to the judgment of others who have the power to assess it. This is why applying worth to persons in the ordinary economic sense produces something uncomfortable. A person's worth fluctuating with their productivity, their health, their usefulness to whoever is doing the evaluating. If dignity was simply another name for worth, it would inherit all of this.
the ranking, the conditionality, the exposure to being reassessed downward. That is precisely what every strong account of dignity insists cannot be true. Dignity is supposed to be the thing that remains when worth has been calculated and found wanting. Honor is closer to dignity in its history. The two words spent centuries in close proximity, but the difference is structural and important. Honor is earned, and because it is earned, it can be forfeited. A person who violates the code their community recognizes as the ground of honor loses it in the community's eyes and often in their own. This is why honor cultures carry elaborate systems of shame and restoration. Honor is a status achieved and maintained through conduct, which means conduct can remove it. Dignity, in the modern philosophical sense, is meant to be exactly the opposite of this. A person cannot forfeit their dignity through bad behavior. And if you find that claim uncomfortable, that discomfort is pointing at something real, something that will be worth sitting with. The claim is uncomfortable because dignity's unconditional character is precisely what makes it hard to hold on to when the person in question has acted in ways that seem to forfeit any claim to consideration. Respect behaves differently from both. Respect is relational. It requires a receiver and a giver, a direction of flow. You respect someone, meaning your attention and consideration move toward them in a particular way. Respect can be withheld, and its withholding is felt. More importantly, respect responds to properties. A person can be respected for their achievements, their character, their expertise, their endurance. Respect tracks qualities and can be calibrated to them. This makes it a genuinely important moral and social concept, and it does real work in organizing how people treat one another. But it is not dignity. Dignity is supposed to precede the assessment of qualities entirely. It is not earned by having characteristics worth respecting. It attaches to the person prior to any evaluation of what they are like. Value, like worth, carries the smell of calculation. To value something is to weigh it against other possible objects of attention and find it significant. Value is assigned. It is the product of an act of evaluation.
A painting has value to the person who stands before it and experiences something. A relationship has value to the people inside it. These are not fictions. Value is real and matters. But assigned value is always conditional on the act of assignment, which means it can be revoked by the same process that created it. If dignity were a form of value, something assigned to persons by communities, by legal systems, by moral traditions, it would be revisable. History has repeatedly demonstrated what happens when communities revise it. Here is where the generalization arrives and where it needs to be held carefully. The reason none of these four words will substitute for dignity is that each of them builds in some form of conditionality. Conditionality on ranking, on conduct, on properties, on assessment. Dignity's philosophical purpose is to name something that is not conditional in any of these ways. Something that attaches to a person simply by virtue of being a person, prior to their rank, their behavior, their usefulness, their qualities, or anyone's evaluation of those things. This is what makes the concept philosophically ambitious and politically necessary. It is also what makes it philosophically unstable. Because as soon as you ask what that unconditioned status rests on, the ground shifts. The most persistent answer has been rational capacity, the ability to reason, to set ends, to govern oneself through judgment rather than instinct. This is the line that runs from Kant's analysis into most modern rights frameworks. But rational capacity is itself a property, and properties admit of degrees and of absence. An infant
does not yet reason in the relevant sense. A person in late-stage dementia has lost capacities they once had. A person with severe cognitive disability may never have had them in the form the argument requires. If dignity is grounded in rational capacity, then the people who most urgently need the protection that dignity is supposed to provide are the ones the grounding most struggles to include. A person in the closing hours of a long illness, unable to communicate, unrecognizable to themselves in the mirror, this person is not displaying rational capacity in the way the philosophical argument seems to require. And yet the intuition that their dignity is fully intact, fully demanding of the same care and attention as anyone else's, is nearly universal among people who have sat with the dying. That intuition is doing something philosophically important. It is marking the limit of the rational capacity grounding while insisting that dignity persists anyway. The grounding does not hold at the edges of life, and the edges of life are exactly the places where the concept must hold or fail. A single person in that situation, the grandmother who no longer recognizes the faces of her children, whose body is cared for by strangers in a way that is either tender or perfunctory, depending on who is working that morning, makes the abstract problem concrete and immediate. What the person who cares for her with tenderness is responding to is not her current rational capacity. It is something else. The philosophical tradition has not fully named what that something else is. Pointing at it, without being able to name it, is not a failure of argument. It is an honest report on where the argument currently stands. This is the limit the concept hits when the distinctions between dignity and its neighbors have been pressed far enough. Dignity can be defined by what it excludes: ranking, conditionality, forfeiture, relational dependence, with more precision than it can be defined by what it includes. The negative definition is sharp and useful. The positive one, the account of what dignity actually is and what it rests on, softens at exactly the moment when clarity would matter most. That softening is not a problem to be solved by finding better language. It reflects something unresolved at the center of the concept, the fact that the demand for unconditional human status has been clearly heard, widely shared, and built into the architecture of modern law and ethics, while the philosophical account of why that demand is justified remains genuinely open. There is a sequence that repeats across regimes, across centuries, across cultures so different in every other respect that the repetition itself demands attention. When a political system decides to unmake a group of people, not simply to punish them, not simply to control them, but to undo them as subjects, it rarely begins with the most extreme available violence. It begins earlier, with something more precise. It begins with dignity. The sequence follows a recognizable order. Names are stripped first, or altered, or replaced with numbers. This is not administrative convenience. It is a targeted act. A name is the most basic marker of individual particularity, the minimum grammatical unit of personhood. Removing it removes the claim that there is a particular someone here, distinguishable from every other instance of the category they have been assigned to. The category does the work that the name used to do, and categories are managed differently from persons. After the name, small choices disappear. Not all choices at once. That would be too legible, too obviously an act of war. Small choices first: where you may sit, when you may speak, what you may wear, whether you may move through a particular door. Each removal is individually minor. Together they establish something structural. The person is no longer someone whose preferences organize the world around them. They have become someone whose movements are organized by others. Then comes the part that is most philosophically revealing and the most deliberately constructed. The degradation is made visible. The person is required to perform it publicly, to bow, to wear the marking, to repeat the humiliating phrase, to participate in the ceremony of their own reduction. This is not cruelty added on top of the process. It is the point of the process. The public performance of submission has two audiences simultaneously, the people watching and the person performing. Something is being said to both. To the witnesses, it says that this person's status is confirmed, that what is being done is in order, that the structure of the world has been correctly arranged. To the person themselves, it attempts to install the reduction as their own self-understanding, to make them internalize what is being done to them as something they have participated in, perhaps even endorsed. This is why the ceremony matters to the regime more than the physical constraint alone would. Physical constraint controls a body. The performance of submission reaches for something further in. The sequence reveals something that could not be as clearly seen without it. Dignity is not one feature among others that constitute a person. It is the load-bearing element. It is the thing upon which the rest of personhood stands. If you want to dismantle the person as subject while keeping the body functional, this is where you aim. The political strategist who understands this is working with an accurate model of what persons are made of, even while using that understanding for destruction. What the sequence does not reveal at first is why it so often fails to fully achieve its purpose. The historical record shows the sequence being executed with precision, and it also shows people surviving it with something intact, not unharmed, not unchanged, but intact in a way that confounds the logic of the method. A person who has been stripped of their name, had their choices removed, been made to perform their own humiliation publicly, and yet retains something that organizes their interior from within. This person is demonstrating, by surviving, that the load-bearing element the attack was aimed at was not successfully reached. The attack was accurate in its targeting. The target turned out to be located somewhere the attack could not fully reach.
This is not a consoling conclusion. The history that surrounds it is full of cases where the attack succeeded, where the systematic reduction of dignity produced exactly the psychological devastation it was designed to produce, where the person who survived the sequence emerged unable to inhabit what remained of themselves. The fact that the target is not always destroyed does not mean the attack is benign or that the damage is minor. The damage is real, documented, transmitted across generations. What the partial survival shows is not that dignity is invulnerable. It shows that it is not entirely housed where the attack lands. The load-bearing metaphor rewards a moment's pressure. What does it mean to say dignity is load-bearing within personhood? It means that the other attributes of a person, their social standing, their sense of entitlement to take up space, their capacity to assert preferences, their belief that their pain is worth attending to, depend on something beneath them. That something is the working assumption that they are a subject of a kind that matters. When that assumption is functioning, the person moves through the world in a particular way. They make claims, resist impositions, orient themselves toward what they need and want and believe. When that assumption is attacked systematically, the other attributes begin to fail, not because they have been directly attacked, but because what supports them has been destabilized. This is why the sequence of regime-level attacks on dignity is so economically efficient from the perspective of control. You do not need to address each feature of personhood individually. Address the foundation, and the features begin to collapse without further intervention. The person whose dignity has been successfully reduced does not need to be coerced on every particular occasion. They have been made into someone who anticipates their own reduction.
who adjusts preemptively, who stops making certain claims before they are denied. The work of oppression is increasingly carried out by the person themselves. The question this raises, and it is not a comfortable one, is whether the concept of dignity that every rights framework invokes in response to exactly this kind of attack is working from an accurate model. The rights document says dignity is inalienable. The sequence of political dismantling says dignity is highly targetable and frequently dismantled. These two claims are not in simple contradiction, but they are in tension. The inalienability may be metaphysically real in some sense. There may be something that genuinely cannot be destroyed, and the psychological, behavioral, relational reality of dignity may still be accessible to attack and damage and long suppression. Inalienable in principle, suppressible in practice. The gap between those two is the space in which most of what needs to be morally understood about dignity actually lives. The rights document cannot close that gap. It can name what should be true and structure legal obligations around that naming. It cannot reach back through the sequence and restore what was targeted. Something else is required for that, something more intimate, more persistent, more embedded in daily relational life than any declaration. What that something is, and whether it can be reliably provided, is a question the law defers to other institutions, and those institutions defer back to individuals, and individuals are often left holding it without preparation for the weight. The sequence attacks a foundation. Rebuilding foundations is different work, slower work, and it does not proceed by the same logic as the dismantling. Humiliation does not end when the act ends. This seems obvious when you first hear it, and then, if you hold it for a moment, it becomes strange. Because if dignity is truly inalienable, truly impossible to remove, then what exactly is it that lingers? What is the residue of an attack on something that cannot be successfully attacked? The trace lives in the body first, in the way a person holds their shoulders in a room where they have been made to feel small, in the speed with which they step aside when someone is moving toward them in a corridor, the reflex that says, "I take up less space than you, my presence is more negotiable than yours." These are not metaphors. They are measurable postural habits, learned through repeated experience of being treated as someone whose presence is provisional, whose preferences are irrelevant, whose discomfort is not a signal anyone is required to respond to. The body has been educated. It carries the curriculum long after the school is over.
Then there is what a person believes they are permitted to want. This is subtler and reaches deeper. Someone who has been systematically humiliated by a parent, by an institution, by a political structure that organized their entire early life around their inferiority, often does not go on to want freely. They want within a range that has been established for them by the humiliation. They anticipate the denial before the request has been made. They calibrate their desires downward to avoid the exposure of asking and being refused, because that exposure, that moment of reaching and being shown that reaching is inappropriate for someone like them, has happened enough times that the body has learned to prevent it from happening again by simply not reaching. The desire itself has been adjusted to match the assigned status. So the gap opens. On one side of it sits the philosophical claim that dignity is present, intact, metaphysically undamaged, as real in this person as in anyone else. On the other side sits the life actually being lived, where that dignity has no traction, where it cannot organize behavior or belief or the sense of what one is owed. The claim may be true. The life is also true. Both things are happening simultaneously, and the distance between them is not a philosophical error waiting to be corrected. It is an injury.
This is one of the deepest things one person can do to another: create that gap. To suppress the practical force of something that cannot be metaphysically destroyed. To make a person live alongside their own dignity as if it belonged to someone else, as if it were a fact about them that had nothing to do with how they moved through their days. The philosophical tradition is, on the whole, better equipped to describe the first side of the gap than the second. It can argue, rigorously and at length, that dignity is present. It is less practiced at describing what it means for that presence to be experientially unavailable.
Consider what it takes for a person who has undergone sustained humiliation to reclaim the felt reality of their own dignity. Not to be told they have it, that is the easy part, and it rarely does the work by itself. To actually experience it as operative, as something that organizes their expectations and their claims, and their sense of what treatment they will accept. This recovery, when it happens, is not primarily a cognitive event. A person does not think their way from the suppression of dignity to its lived reality simply by encountering a persuasive argument. Something relational is usually required. Someone who treats them as if the dignity is real, consistently, over time, in specific acts of attention and response. The philosophical truth needs a vehicle, and the vehicle is almost always another person. Which creates a problem the philosophical frameworks have trouble holding. If dignity is inalienable and universal, its practical force should not depend on whether the right person happened to appear at the right time and respond in the right way. Yet experience strongly suggests it does. The person who had a parent who saw them clearly, who had a teacher who reflected back the reality of their particular mind, who had a community that organized its practices around the assumption that its members were fully subjects. That person carries dignity differently than someone for whom none of this was available. Same metaphysical status, profoundly different access to it. The trace of humiliation and the dependence on relational repair are not separate phenomena. They are the same phenomenon, seen from opposite directions. What humiliation installs, sustained, dignifying attention can, slowly and incompletely, begin to displace. But the incompleteness matters. The trace does not simply vanish when conditions improve. It persists in the body, in the habits of wanting, in the reflexes around claims and space and permission, in ways that may soften over years but rarely disappear entirely. Someone who was taught in their first decade that their needs were not worth responding to does not arrive at 40 having fully recovered the sense that their needs are worth responding to, even if the intervening decades were full of evidence to the contrary. The early education has priority. The body gave it tenure. There is something honest required here, which is to say plainly that this makes the inalienability claim complicated in a way that cannot be resolved by restating it more firmly. Dignity may be inalienable in the sense that it cannot be metaphysically removed. The personhood is still there. The status is still there. Nothing that was done to the person has actually changed what kind of being they are. And the practical force of that status, the degree to which it can actually do anything in a person's life, can be so thoroughly suppressed by what has happened to them that the inalienability functions as cold comfort. True, and nearly beside the point of what they are living with. The philosophical tradition tends to respond to this by distinguishing between dignity as a fact and the recognition of dignity as a practice. The fact cannot be destroyed. The recognition can be withheld, can be systemically refused, can be so thoroughly absent from a person's formative experience that they arrive in adulthood carrying something they have never been helped to inhabit. The distinction is real and useful. It does not close the problem. It names the location of the problem more precisely.
What lives in the gap between the fact and the experienced reality is not a philosophical puzzle.
It is a person, trying to build a life on ground that was made unstable before they were old enough to understand what stability was, and carrying the consequences of that in the particular, bodily, habitual, hope-adjusting ways that no rights document was designed to address and no philosophical argument can reach. Dignity is inalienable, and yet there are people alive right now who have never experienced it as theirs. Not because it was taken, the philosophical tradition insists it cannot be, but because it was never reflected back to them in a way that made it real. That gap is the subject here, and it is worth sitting with before reaching past it. A child is not born knowing what kind of being they are. They are born needing to be told, and not just in words, in the quality of attention, in whether their hunger is treated as something worth responding to, in whether their distress registers on the faces around them as something that matters. These are the first communications about status. Long before a child can reason about personhood or understand the word dignity, they are receiving information about whether they are the kind of thing whose experience counts. The body records this. The nervous system archives it. It becomes the working assumption beneath everything that follows. This means something uncomfortable about the inalienability claim. Whatever is true at the metaphysical level, and something may genuinely be true there, the psychological reality of dignity is not self-generating. It requires transmission. It needs to be passed from one person to another through sustained, specific, repeated acts of recognition. Someone speaks to you as though your thoughts are worth hearing. Someone treats your discomfort as a signal worth attending to. Someone's behavior consistently implies that your preferences are relevant to how the space between you is organized. These acts are not decoration on top of a pre-existing felt reality. They are often the condition of that felt reality existing at all. There is a version of this that sounds manageable, almost administrative. Provide the right conditions in early life, and dignity develops as expected. Withhold those conditions, and it fails to take root. But the actual texture of the problem is harder than that, because the transmission is not a single event or a program that can be completed. It is ongoing, cumulative, vulnerable to interruption. A person who received adequate recognition in childhood and then spent years inside an institution, a workplace, a marriage, a political context, that systematically refused to register their personhood, will find that the earlier foundation erodes. The body updates. The working assumption adjusts. Sustained absence of recognition has the same architectural effect as its early withdrawal. It teaches the person, at a level beneath argument, that their dignity is conditional, negotiable, revocable. The paradox is exact and not easily dissolved. Dignity is described in every major rights framework and most philosophical accounts as unconditional, possessed without qualification, independent of what happens to you or what others think of you. At the same time, its psychological force, the degree to which it actually organizes a person's behavior and expectations and sense of what they are owed, depends continuously on relational conditions outside the person's control. Unconditional in status, conditional in experience. These two are not the same thing, and treating them as equivalent is one of the ways that serious thinking about dignity goes wrong. A rights document cannot do this work. The declaration that every person possesses dignity is a legal and moral fact of enormous importance. It establishes obligations, structures protections, grounds the architecture of law. What it cannot do is reach into the body of the person who was never spoken to with attention, never treated as someone whose presence organized the room, and install the felt knowledge that the declaration describes. The declaration addresses the world. The felt knowledge is built in relation.
in the specific texture of how one particular person is treated by another particular person over time, in ordinary moments that no document governs. There is something that follows from this, and it lands differently than most conclusions about dignity. If the transmission of dignity's psychological reality is relational, if it depends on people rather than documents, then every person who treats another as a full subject is doing something philosophically serious. Not symbolically, structurally. The teacher who speaks to a child as if their confusion is worth taking seriously, the colleague who responds to a question without the flicker of dismissal, the parent who stays present when the child is distressed rather than signaling that the distress is inconvenient. Each of these acts is participating in the transmission of something that no institution can supply wholesale. What complicates this further is that the people least likely to have received adequate transmission are also the people least likely to be positioned to provide it easily. The person whose early experience taught them that their needs were not worth responding to carries that lesson into every relational context, including the ones where they might otherwise transmit recognition to someone else. Deprivation in this domain is not simply personal. It propagates forward through the structure of relationships, through families, through communities. The instability installed in one person's formative experience does not stay with that person. It reshapes how they are present to others, and those others carry the effects further. None of this means the inalienability claim is wrong. Something may genuinely be present, a status, a fact about the kind of being a person is, that survives even the most thorough suppression of its practical force. The person who has never been helped to inhabit their dignity is still, in whatever sense the claim is true, in possession of it. The gap between that possession and any felt experience of it is real, and it can span a lifetime. Inalienable in the sense that nothing removes it, inaccessible in the sense that the ground required to stand on it was never built. The concept contains both of these, simultaneously, without resolution. Living with that is what the concept actually asks.
The body is always there.
Every serious attempt to place dignity in the mind alone, in the rational capacity, in the soul conceived as separate from flesh, every such attempt runs into the same problem. When dignity is violated, it is violated through the body. The touch that was not permitted, the posture that was forced, the face held at a particular angle, while someone demonstrated that the person's presence was disposable. Humiliation does not arrive as an abstract message delivered to the intellect. It arrives in the skin. This is worth pressing because the most philosophically rigorous accounts of dignity tend toward the interior. Kant's version grounds dignity in rational agency, the capacity to give oneself the moral law, to act from principle rather than inclination. The Stoic version grounds it in the ruling faculty, the inner citadel that no external force can enter without permission. Both of these framings do something important. They remove dignity from the jurisdiction of whatever happens to the body, and in doing so they protect it from the contingencies of physical life. If dignity lives in reason, then what is done to the flesh cannot reach it. The argument is powerful. It is also haunted by everything it cannot account for. Because the violation, when it comes, goes for the body first. Strip a person of their clothing, and you have communicated something that no philosophical argument, delivered in the same moment, can neutralize. Constrain posture. Make a person kneel. Make them stand without moving. Make them occupy less physical space than their body naturally requires. And the message is not merely informational. It is installed in the nervous system through the position itself. The body is not the packaging around the person. In some register, that the purely mental accounts struggle to integrate. The body is where the person lives. A person held in a cell knows this. The dimensions of the space communicate their status before any word is spoken. The quality of light, whether natural or denied, says something about what the person's perceptual needs are worth, whether they are permitted to move freely or must request permission for the smallest physical act. These are not peripheral conditions affecting a disembodied dignity located elsewhere. They are direct communications to the person about what kind of being they are, delivered through the medium in which persons actually exist. Physical confinement is one of the most ancient tools of degradation, precisely because the body is not separable from the one who inhabits it. This creates a specific difficulty for the inalienability argument. The argument works cleanly if dignity is located somewhere outside the reach of physical events. And then the question arrives, if physical treatment cannot touch dignity, why does physical treatment communicate about dignity so directly, so universally, so efficiently? Every known culture uses bodily humiliation as a signal of status reduction. Every known culture uses bodily honor, elevation, adornment, the granting of space, as a signal of status affirmation. The body is the universal language in which dignity is confirmed and denied, long before any philosophical vocabulary appears. If dignity truly had nothing to do with the body, this universality would be puzzling. The body would be an irrelevant medium for a message about something located elsewhere. That is not what the evidence suggests. The philosophical tradition is not entirely blind to this. There are accounts, phenomenological ones, accounts rooted in what it is actually like to be a person in a body, that resist the move to locate dignity purely in the rational interior. Maurice Merleau-Ponty spent much of his work demonstrating that the body is not an instrument the mind uses, but the condition through which a person is present in the world at all. On that account, to violate the body is to violate the presence, not as a side effect, but directly. The body is the being's first address, the place from which all orientation begins. Degradation that targets that address is not metaphorically attacking dignity. It is attacking the site where the person actually is. What follows from this matters practically. If dignity has a body, then the conditions in which a body exists are always already conditions relevant to dignity. The temperature of the room, whether pain is attended to or left unaddressed, whether illness is treated as a problem worth solving. These are not separate from the question of dignity. They are part of it. And the philosophical account that insists dignity is interior and indestructible has to explain, on its own terms, why the systematic neglect of a person's physical conditions is recognized universally as a violation of their dignity. The Stoic might say, the person can maintain interior freedom regardless. The body, subjected to prolonged cold or hunger or pain, tends to disagree, not intellectually, but in the way it collapses the distance between physical deprivation and the experienced reality of what one is worth. There is a further dimension to this that the purely mental account has to work hardest to explain. The dignity of dying is not only a question about the mind's final state, it is a question about what happens to the body. Whether a dying person's physical discomfort is managed as though it matters, whether they are left in positions that are undignified, whether their physical helplessness is met with attention or with the indifference that signals that their body is no longer a subject's body, merely an object requiring maintenance. The people who care for the dying understand this without needing a philosophy seminar. They know, in practice, that the difference between a dignified death and an undignified one is written largely in physical terms, in whether touch is gentle, in whether the person's bodily preferences are still treated as preferences rather than inconveniences. The body does not cancel the interior. The fear, the reasoning, the particular consciousness of the dying person, all of that is present. The point is that neither cancels the other. Dignity in the final hours is not composed entirely of either the mind or the body. It is composed of the relationship between them, of whether the whole person, which is to say, the embodied person, is being treated as someone whose experience still constitutes a claim on those around them. When that treatment fails, no internal philosophical commitment repairs the damage. The interior can resist. It cannot make the external irrelevant.
What this means for the concept itself is that any account of dignity that fully severs it from the body is making a philosophical choice that the experience of violation consistently refuses to confirm. The experience says, yes, here, in the flesh, this is where it was attacked. The philosopher says, then what was attacked was not dignity itself, only its external conditions. The gap between those two responses is not merely verbal. It reflects a genuine disagreement about where a person is, and therefore about what it means to harm them. That disagreement does not resolve in favor of the purely mental account simply because the mental account is philosophically tidier. The messiness is in the subject matter. And the subject matter is a person with a body in the world. The arc of a life is not an abstraction. It has a beginning that the person did not choose, a middle that they navigate with varying degrees of freedom, and an end that arrives in conditions they may or may not have any power to shape. Most philosophical thinking about dignity concentrates on the middle, on what is owed to a person while they are fully present, reasoning, acting, capable of asserting their claim on the world. The question of the end receives less careful attention. And yet, what happens at the end is where the temporal dimension of dignity becomes impossible to ignore. The right to die with dignity is contested almost everywhere it is raised, in courts, in legislatures, in hospital corridors, in religious institutions, in the arguments families have quietly around beds. The specific legal questions vary. The underlying philosophical tension does not. At the center of every serious version of this debate is a question about whether dignity is a static fact or something with a shape across time, whether it is simply present like a property or whether it can be sustained, eroded, or recovered like a condition. Consider what it means to say that someone died with dignity. The phrase is used often enough to have become almost invisible, but it is pointing at something real. When people use it, they are describing a convergence. The person was present to their own ending. Their physical experience was attended to. Their preferences were treated as still mattering. The people around them behaved as though their consciousness remained a claim on the room. The phrase describes not a single moment, but a set of conditions sustained over time. And when people say that someone was denied a dignified death, they are describing the failure of those conditions: pain unmanaged, wishes overridden, the body treated as a problem to be processed rather than a person to be accompanied. This is where the temporal structure emerges clearly. Dignity in dying is not reducible to dignity in a single instant. It is about whether the arc holds, whether the person remains in the perception of those around them and in the structures of care that surround them, someone whose experience constitutes a demand. The long diminishment that sometimes precedes death, the gradual loss of physical capacity, the dependency that increases, the functions that require assistance and then require more, tests this continuously. Each stage is an occasion for the surrounding world either to maintain the recognition or to allow it to slip, quietly, into a mode of handling that substitutes efficiency for attention and maintenance for presence. The mechanism through which this erosion happens is rarely deliberate. Most people who contribute to an undignified death are not acting from contempt. They are acting from habit, exhaustion, the pressures of institutional time, the difficulty of remaining fully present to suffering that does not resolve. The family member who stops asking how the person feels and begins reporting to them what will happen next. The nurse who adjusts the body without speaking to the person it belongs to. These are not cruelties. They are small failures of recognition, accumulated over days and weeks, and their cumulative effect is that the person begins to experience themselves as an object of management rather than a subject of care. The philosophical claim that they retain their dignity throughout may be correct. The practical reality of what they are living through moves in a different direction. Where this thinking breaks open is in the question of what a person is owed when their death cannot be made to feel like a dignified conclusion to a life. There are deaths that arrive in conditions of prolonged suffering that cannot be adequately managed, or that require a level of intervention that the person themselves experiences as violating rather than sustaining their sense of self. The right to die debate is, at its philosophical core, a debate about whether the person's own judgment about those conditions is the relevant authority. Whether their assessment of what constitutes a dignified arc for their life takes precedence over external standards that claim to know what dignity requires of them. This is where the tension inside the concept becomes most visible. Dignity has always contained two registers that press against each other. The first is dignity as the person's own self-determined claim, the experienced sense of what it means to live and die as oneself. What conditions are compatible with remaining a subject rather than becoming an object? What the person judges to be consistent with their understanding of their own personhood. The second is dignity as a standard that stands apart from any individual's preference, a condition that can be recognized from the outside, that imposes obligations on others, and that cannot simply be redefined by the person whose dignity is at stake. Both of these are real. A person can genuinely misjudge the conditions of their own dignity. Despair can distort the assessment. External pressure can shape what feels livable. The experience of illness can make permanent what may be temporary. External recognition has a role precisely because no person is the only authority on their own situation. At the same time, a standard of dignity that systematically overrides the person's own assessment of what their life means, what constitutes an acceptable end for them, what they can bear and what they cannot. That standard begins to use dignity as a way of removing the person's agency rather than protecting it. It begins to treat the person as a vessel for someone else's idea of a dignified life, rather than as the subject of their own. The right to die debate does not resolve this tension. What it does is make the tension precise. It forces into the open a question that the concept of dignity contains, but usually manages to keep implicit. Who is the final authority on what a dignified life and a dignified death require? And it reveals that this question cannot be answered by appealing to dignity itself, because the concept carries both answers simultaneously: the person's sovereignty over their own ending, and the claim that some things stand above that sovereignty and constrain it. What the debate also reveals, and this is its deeper philosophical contribution, is that dignity is not a snapshot. Every formulation that treats it as a fixed property, present or absent, intact or violated, misses something the dying expose. Dignity, across the arc of a life, is something that can be sustained or allowed to fail, supported or undermined, not in a single moment, but through the continuous quality of recognition that surrounds a person from first consciousness to last. The final hours do not stand apart from everything that preceded them. They are the point at which every earlier act of recognition, every failure of attention, every small choice about whether to treat this person as a full subject or as a diminishing body, all of that becomes visible as the pattern it always was. There is no clean conclusion here because the concept refuses one. What the temporal dimension adds to the understanding of dignity is a kind of moral pressure that operates along an axis the philosophical tradition has underdeveloped. The pressure is this, that the recognition owed to a person does not reduce as their life nears its end. The obligation does not taper with capacity. If anything, the final period, when the person is most dependent, most exposed, least able to assert their own claim through action, is the period when the surrounding world's commitment to their dignity is tested most severely. What that test reveals, in practice, is not only a fact about care systems or medical ethics, it is a fact about what a community actually believes about the people who belong to it. There is a difference between having something and living from it. Dignity, in most of the frameworks that claim it as foundational, is described as a possession, something belonging to you, present in you, accompanying you whether or not you are aware of it. The description is meant to be reassuring. It also sidesteps the harder question, which is what it means to hold something you are not using. A claim is not the same as a passive fact. The difference operates in ordinary life all the time. A person can possess a skill they never exercise, a language they no longer speak, a capacity that has gone so long without being called on that it recedes into something theoretical. Whether this matters depends on what the possession is. For dignity, it matters enormously, because the version of dignity that can survive any external assault, that cannot be stripped by humiliation, force, or deprivation, is not the same as the version that actually shapes how a person moves through the world, what they demand for themselves, what they refuse. The active claim asks something. This is the formulation that most philosophical comfort-giving about dignity tends to avoid, because it introduces a burden alongside the reassurance. The burden is that dignity is not only owed to you by others, it is also something you can fail to assert, fail to inhabit, fail to act from. And that failure is a different kind of damage than anything another person can inflict.
What does it mean to act in accordance with your dignity? The question sounds abstract until it touches something specific. A person who accepts treatment that they know, somewhere that is not quite conscious, falls below what they are owed. A person who silences a protest in themselves because the protest seems too costly, too inconvenient, too likely to produce a response they cannot manage. A person who shapes themselves over years around what others are willing to recognize in them, taking in the diminishment because the alternative requires something they are not sure they have. In all of these cases, the philosophical guarantee remains in place. Dignity as metaphysical fact has not been revoked. What has happened is something else. The gap between possessing it and inhabiting it has widened until the possession becomes almost notional. This is where the concept begins to touch courage. Not the dramatic kind, necessarily, not courage as a visible act performed for an audience. The quieter form, which is the refusal to let the gap continue widening. The small interior act of taking one's own claim seriously enough to let it shape a response, a word, a decision to stop participating in the story someone else has written about what you are worth. That act is demanding in proportion to how long the gap has been allowed to grow. And the fact that it is demanding is what makes it a genuine moral territory, not merely a philosophical category. A philosopher who spent much of his life thinking about what it means to bear oneself with integrity under conditions of external pressure, Jean Amery, writing after surviving the camps, described something he called the right to self-affirmation, the claim to one's own dignity that does not wait for external confirmation before asserting itself. He was writing from conditions most people will never face. But the structure he identified is not limited to extreme circumstances. The assertion of a self-affirming claim against a world that has communicated indifference, contempt, or simply inattention, that structure is available at much smaller scales, and it operates through the same logic. Dignity as an active claim is the willingness to say, "This is what I am owed, and I am saying so from myself, not waiting to receive it as a gift." Now press that further because it generates a problem. If dignity requires assertion, if the active form is genuinely different from the passive possession, and the difference carries moral weight, then it becomes possible to speak of something like self-betrayal. Not as a melodrama, but as a precise description, the person who has colluded, quietly and over time, in their own diminishment, who has accepted the framing, absorbed the reduction, built their expectations around it. Can this happen without violation by another person at all? Can the gap between possessed dignity and inhabited dignity open entirely through internal choices?
The answer seems to be yes. And this is uncomfortable in a particular way. It means that the guarantee of inalienability, the philosophical bedrock, does not protect against every form of loss. What it protects against is the metaphysical destruction of the status. It does not protect against the long habit of treating your own claim as negotiable, expendable, contingent on whether others are willing to honor it first. This connects the concept of dignity backward to the relational transmission that makes dignity psychologically real in the first place. A person who was never shown in the early years that their presence constituted a claim, who received the communication through 100 small interactions that their needs were burdensome, their distress optional, their selfhood a variable rather than a given, that person faces a particular kind of work. The active claim is available to them. The philosophical guarantee remains in place, but to move from the passive possession to the active assertion requires overriding a pattern that was installed before there were words for it. That is not nothing. It is, in many cases, the labor of years, which means the demand that dignity makes of the person who holds it is not evenly distributed. This is a cost that the framework mostly absorbs without acknowledgement. The philosophical formulation says, dignity is present, and acting in accordance with it is a moral requirement. The psychological reality says, for some people, the gap between the theoretical possession and the lived experience of it is so wide that closing it requires precisely the external conditions: recognition, reflection, the experience of being treated as a subject that the inalienability argument says should not be necessary. The tension does not resolve, it just becomes more precise. What remains when the tension is held at this level of precision is a picture of dignity that is more demanding than the reassuring versions and more honest about what it asks. It is not sufficient to know that you have it. The having, without the inhabiting, is a kind of latency, a capacity that exists but does not yet operate.
And latency, in the domain of how a person treats themselves and what they allow to be done to them, is not neutral. It has consequences for what a person believes they are permitted to claim, to refuse, to require. The philosophical guarantee is real. What activates it is not guaranteed at all. There is a specific moral act that most theories of dignity require, and almost none of them describe honestly. The requirement is this: that you extend the recognition of full personhood to someone your every trained instinct is telling you does not deserve it. Not someone unfamiliar or inconvenient or difficult, someone you fear or despise or have been given a coherent story about why they fall outside the circle of those whose dignity makes a claim on you. The act of extending dignity across that line is the load-bearing requirement of every universal rights framework that has ever been constructed. And it is extraordinarily hard.
Hard in a specific way. The difficulty is not primarily emotional, though emotion is involved. It is cognitive. The mechanisms of dehumanization that human societies have used repeatedly and across every known culture work precisely by dismantling the perceptual and conceptual conditions under which recognition becomes possible. They do not typically announce themselves as dehumanization. They arrive as reasonable descriptions. This group is more violent by nature. This person has forfeited the ordinary protections by their actions. This category of human being is fundamentally different in ways that make the usual obligations inapplicable. These descriptions feel, from the inside, like accurate observations rather than frameworks that are actively suppressing the recognition of dignity. That is exactly what makes them effective. So the act of extending dignity across enmity is not simply a decision to feel differently. It requires overriding a set of perceptual habits that have been reinforced by social consensus, by the logic of the situation, sometimes by genuine harm that the other person or group has caused. It requires maintaining the recognition of personhood in the face of everything that has been arranged to make that recognition feel unnecessary, misguided, or dangerous. That is a cognitively demanding act. It takes specific effort, and the effort is not distributed evenly. It is hardest exactly when the stakes are highest, when the perceived threat is most acute, when the social cost of the recognition is most severe. A person who has been treated as an enemy, or who has witnessed what people in that category have done, and who nonetheless holds them as someone whose dignity constitutes a moral claim. That person is not performing a warm feeling. They are performing a specific kind of moral work. The distinction matters because the warm feeling version of extending dignity is available mainly when the cost is low, when the other person is harmless or pitiable, when extending recognition requires nothing beyond the gesture. The hard version operates under completely different conditions. It operates when recognition is costly, when it cuts against self-protection, when the surrounding world is providing a continuous stream of justification for withholding it. The hard version is the one that universal rights frameworks actually depend on. And most of the time, the frameworks do not acknowledge that this version is different from the easy one. Jean Améry, whose formulation of active dignity appeared in the previous thread of this thinking, also wrote about something he called resentment, not as a failure of magnanimity, but as a form of moral insistence. The person who has been dehumanized and who refuses to release the claim that what was done to them mattered, who refuses to extend a forgiveness that would dissolve the weight of the injury, is also doing something with dignity. They are maintaining the recognition of their own personhood at the cost of a certain peace. The extension of dignity to an enemy
does not require the dissolution of that claim. These two things, holding the weight of what was done and still recognizing the personhood of whoever did it, can coexist at great cost without the first cancelling the second. The consequence of not extending this recognition has a structure that is as recognizable as the one described earlier for how regimes dismantle personhood. When a community, a culture, or an individual systematically withholds the recognition of dignity from a defined group, the withdrawal does not stay contained. It requires maintenance. The perceptual framework that supports the withholding has to be sustained against the continuous evidence of shared humanity that proximity keeps generating. Sustaining it requires reinforcement, repeated exposure to the narrative that justifies exclusion, social pressure against those who begin to notice what the framework is suppressing, a gradual coarsening of the capacity to recognize personhood across the line at all. The damage accumulates on both sides of the line. The people whose dignity is denied are injured in the ways already traced. The people doing the denying are injured in a different direction. Their capacity for the recognition of personhood, which is not separable from their own dignity in the full sense, is being continuously narrowed. This is the mechanism that makes extending dignity across enmity a foundational act for rights rather than just a virtuous personal choice. The universality of dignity, if it is to mean anything operationally rather than rhetorically, depends on its extension to precisely the cases where extension is costly. A dignity that applies only to those who are easy to recognize as persons, only when the recognition costs nothing, is not a universal principle. It is a preference operating under favorable conditions. The moment conditions become unfavorable, when the person in front of you has done something terrible or belongs to a group your community has constructed as threatening, or stands on the other side of a conflict in which real harm has been done, that is the moment the claim of universality is either upheld or revealed as conditional. The uncomfortable implication is that the philosophical claim that all persons possess dignity carries a demand that scales directly with difficulty. It does not ask you to recognize dignity when it costs nothing. It asks you to recognize it when everything in the situation is structured to make the recognition feel wrong, unnecessary, or dangerous. This is not an abstract requirement living somewhere in the architecture of rights documents. It is a demand placed on a specific person, in a specific moment, who has specific reasons to withhold. That person may fail. Most people, in most high-stakes situations of this kind, do fail, at least partially, at least sometimes. The failure does not revise the requirement. It simply marks the gap between the philosophical claim and the human capacity to enact it. Which means the question of whether you have extended dignity across your own lines of enmity or difference is not a question about whether you hold the right political positions or subscribe to the right framework. It is a question about specific moments. Whether, in the actual encounter with someone, your trained perception placed outside the circle, you found the recognition or you let it be suppressed. Whether the mechanism of dehumanization operated unopposed, or whether something in you pushed back against it. That push is neither natural nor easy. It is, by the best available account, a learned capacity, one that can be strengthened or allowed to atrophy, depending on whether it is exercised. The dignity of persons you have every reason to withhold recognition from does not depend on your recognition of it. The philosophical guarantee does not require your participation to remain in force. What depends on your recognition is something else, the coherence of your own moral world, and whether the universality you claim to believe in is something you actually inhabit, or something you hold in reserve for when it doesn't cost you anything. The question arrives without warning, and it is one of the most uncomfortable the concept of dignity generates. A person has committed atrocity, not minor harm, not the ordinary cruelties that human life accumulates, but something at the outer edge of what human beings are capable of doing to one another. Does that person retain their dignity?
The answer that most philosophical frameworks reach, when pressed to their foundations, is yes. And the discomfort of that yes is not something to soften or move past quickly. It deserves to be held for a moment, because the discomfort is doing philosophical work. The yes follows directly from the structure of the claim. If dignity is unconditional, if it belongs to persons as such, regardless of what they have done or failed to do, then conditioning it on behavior is already a revision of the concept. The moment you say that dignity can be forfeited through sufficient moral failure, you have shifted from inalienable metaphysical status to something earned and therefore losable. A losable dignity is a different thing entirely. It might still be worth having a concept for, but it would not be the same concept that underwrites the prohibition on torture, the right to a fair trial, the protections extended to prisoners of war. All of those legal and ethical frameworks depend on the dignity of the person holding, regardless of what that person has done. Remove the unconditional structure, and the foundations begin to migrate. The mechanism here is precise. Rights protections for the worst offenders are not there because the worst offenders deserve them in some warm, intuitive sense. They are there because the principle requires universality to function at all. A protection that applies only to those who seem deserving is a preference, not a principle. The moment a society begins identifying categories of persons to whom the unconditional protections do not apply, because of what they have done, what they are, what group they belong to, it has already installed the machinery that has, in every known case, eventually been turned on people who were not the original target. The history of which categories get excluded from dignity's protections is long, and the pattern is consistent. The expansion of exclusion follows from the initial concession that exclusion is permissible. So the discomfort of yes has a structural justification. Holding the dignity of someone who has committed atrocity is not a statement about their worth in any ordinary evaluative sense. It is a statement about the architecture of the principle and what happens to it when exceptions are introduced. But the no is not simply wrong. It has its own philosophical weight, and dismissing it as mere intuition misses something. There is a genuine moral pressure behind the feeling that a person who has enacted the systematic destruction of other persons' dignity, who has participated in the machinery of dehumanization described earlier in this thinking, has done something to their own standing as a subject. The philosopher Avishai Margalit, thinking through the ethics of memory and moral witness, worked with the question of what it means for a person to have acted in ways that place them, in the moral imagination of others, outside the circle of ordinary human recognition. He did not arrive at a simple answer. He stayed with the difficulty.
The difficulty is real because it lives inside the concept itself. Dignity is supposed to be non-comparative and non-forfeitable. But persons are also agents. An agency means that what a person does is genuinely attributable to them. It is theirs. It shapes the moral reality they inhabit. The pure metaphysical account, the one that locates dignity entirely in rational nature rather than in anything a person enacts, has to work hard to explain why actions matter morally at all if the underlying status of the actor is untouched by them. The account that makes dignity forfeitable has to work hard to explain how any universal protection survives the question of who decides when forfeiture has occurred, and on what basis,
and with what safeguards against that determination being made by those with an interest in exclusion. Neither resolution holds cleanly. The yes preserves the universality at the cost of something that registers in most people's moral perception as a significant demand. The no honors the weight of agency at the cost of the unconditional structure on which rights depend. What you think here is not merely a position on an abstract question. It reflects something about what you take persons to be, whether the status of personhood is something that floats above what persons do, or whether it is entangled with the moral history of their actions in ways the concept struggles to fully accommodate. There is an additional pressure point. The person who has committed atrocity is also, in many cases, the product of conditions, of dehumanization received, transmitted, enacted, that the same framework of dignity would recognize as serious injuries to the psychological reality of personhood. This does not excuse the actions, but it complicates the picture of a free-standing agent whose choices are fully separable from the conditions that formed them. The framework of dignity, which insists on the full subjecthood of every person, also insists on the moral significance of the conditions under which persons develop. These two insistences are in tension with each other when applied to the question of severe moral failure. The person who commits atrocity is both a full agent and a person shaped by conditions. Both things are true simultaneously, and the concept has to carry the weight of both at once. What cannot happen, the move that forecloses thinking rather than continuing it, is to arrive at easy comfort on either side. The yes that comes too quickly, that holds the dignity of an atrocity's perpetrator without registering the full weight of what is being held, has not actually met the question. It has used the philosophical framework as a way of not feeling what the question is asking you to feel. The no that comes as relief, as the sense that finally the principle can be set aside for someone who has truly earned exclusion, has not met the question either. It has allowed the discomfort of unconditional commitment to resolve into something that feels more proportionate, more satisfying, and considerably more dangerous. The question does not close. What it does is reveal the exact architecture of the concept, where the load is distributed, where the structure bears stress, where the material begins to show strain without breaking. Dignity that is unconditional in easy cases and conditional in hard ones was never unconditional to begin with. And dignity that is genuinely unconditional asks you to hold something, in the hardest cases, that you may not feel you have the capacity to hold. That gap between the philosophical requirement and the human capacity to meet it is not a defect of the concept. It is the measure of what the concept actually demands. Dignity gets used as a shield, and sometimes the person it shields is the person it was supposed to protect, which means the shield has been turned around. This is one of the most specific tensions the concept generates, and it deserves to be named precisely rather than gestured at. There are cases, not hypothetical, not rare, where the language of dignity is invoked to override what a person has said about their own life, their own body, their own wishes, about how they want to live or die or be treated. The invocation is sincere. The person using it genuinely believes they are protecting something, and the person whose wishes are being overridden is left in the position of having their own dignity cited as the reason their preferences do not count. A person in a hospital, at the end of their life, expresses clearly what they want. The request is refused on grounds that complying would violate their dignity. The concept that was meant to guarantee their status as a full subject
as someone whose expressed wishes constitute a moral claim, becomes the instrument by which that claim is set aside. Something has misfired. The question is whether the misfiring is a matter of cynical misuse, or whether it points to a genuine instability inside the idea itself. Cynical misuse is real and should not be underestimated. Powerful institutions, legal systems, and moral traditions have all, at various points, reached for the language of dignity when the underlying motivation was something else. Social control, professional authority, ideological continuity, the comfort of those making the decision rather than the person it affects. The vocabulary of dignity provides cover that cruder language cannot. Saying that a procedure violates human dignity sounds different from saying that the institution does not want to permit it, even though the practical result is the same. Language matters here because the coating of moral seriousness that dignity provides can make what is essentially a power relation appear to be a philosophical commitment.
But the problem runs deeper than cynicism. Even when the invocation is fully sincere, something structurally complicated is happening. The concept of dignity carries within it two different accounts of what it is doing and who it belongs to. In one account, dignity is the individual's own claim. It is what the person asserts about themselves, the standard by which they measure their own treatment, the basis of their autonomy over their own life. In this account, overriding someone's expressed wishes in the name of their dignity is almost by definition a contradiction in terms. Their wishes are the expression of their dignity, not something dignity stands above. In the other account, dignity is not purely self-determined. It is a standard that exists independently of what any individual happens to want, a structural feature of personhood that sets certain conditions on how persons may be treated, regardless of consent. This account is what makes it possible to say that certain things remain violations of dignity, even when consented to, that a person can be degraded even with their agreement, that there are forms of treatment which fall below what persons are owed as persons, and which individual preference cannot simply override. This account has genuine philosophical grounding. It is not merely authoritarian cover. It reflects something real about the concept, that dignity is not just a name for whatever a person chooses, that it carries content, that some of that content may conflict with what a specific person, in a specific moment, under specific pressures, says they want. The tension between these two accounts cannot be dissolved by choosing one and ignoring the other. The individual claim account, if taken to its logical limit, makes dignity indistinguishable from preference. It becomes a philosophical endorsement of autonomy and nothing more, which is a perfectly coherent position, but one that has abandoned most of what made the concept distinct. The independent standard account, if taken to its logical limit, licenses exactly the move described above. Indefinite override of individual wishes by those who have decided they know better what the person's dignity requires. And the people making that determination are rarely the ones whose dignity is being decided. What actually happens in most frameworks that try to work with dignity seriously is that both accounts operate simultaneously, which means the concept is internally in tension at its core, not just at its application. The same foundation that protects individuals from having their personhood overridden also provides the vocabulary for that overriding when a different set of values controls the interpretation. The concept does not come with built-in protection against this. It comes with a structural ambiguity that different actors will fill differently, depending on what they take persons to be and who they think is authorized to say. The places where dignity as standard most frequently gets invoked against the individual include reproductive choices, end-of-life decisions, and certain categories of labor or contract
that some frameworks declare inherently incompatible with human dignity, regardless of the persons involved. In each of these areas, the pattern is the same. Someone's expressed wishes about their own life are met with the claim that those wishes, if enacted, would damage something, either in the person themselves or in what persons are understood to be as a category, that exceeds what the individual is authorized to trade away. The claim is serious. It is also the claim that has historically been used to deny agency to exactly the populations who have had the least power to resist the denial. This does not make the claim wrong. It makes it dangerous, in a specific way that has to be taken seriously, alongside whatever philosophical content it carries. The danger is not located only in bad actors misusing good language. It is located in the structure of the concept, in the fact that a standard meant to protect persons from being overridden can generate, through its own internal logic, exactly the kind of override it was designed to resist. There is a small but precise case that opens the problem clearly. A person seeks a medical procedure that others regard as degrading. They do not regard it as degrading. They regard it as consistent with who they are, with their own sense of what their life requires and what their body means to them. The refusal is framed as a protection of their dignity. But the dignity being protected is a version of their personhood that they themselves do not recognize, one that has been constructed by those doing the protecting, according to a standard the person being protected did not choose and does not endorse. The protection from the inside feels like its opposite. This is not a contrived case. Versions of it occur in medicine, in law, in religious institutions, in the ordinary operation of social life. What the concept of dignity has to reckon with, in cases like this, is not just who gets to apply the standard, but what the standard is actually grounded in. If it is grounded in the rational agency of persons, in the capacity to direct one's own life according to one's own understanding, then overriding that agency in the name of dignity defeats itself. If it is grounded in something about what persons are that stands above their own self-understanding, then the concept carries in its foundation a permanent opening for paternalism. And the philosophical tradition has not resolved which of these groundings is correct, because the concept needs both to do all the work it is asked to do. And the two groundings are not fully compatible.
This is where the concept shows its stress lines most clearly. Not in the easy cases, not in the prohibitions on torture or arbitrary imprisonment, where the individual claim and the independent standard align. It shows them here, where someone's own voice is in conflict with the framework meant to speak for them. The concept does not break at this point, but it requires something from whoever is applying it. The recognition that invoking dignity against a person's expressed wishes is an act that carries a specific burden of justification, a burden that cannot be discharged simply by the sincerity of the invocation or the authority of the tradition behind it. The weight of that justification falls on those doing the invoking, not on the person whose life is at stake. And whether that weight is actually carried, rather than simply assumed, is a question that most invocations of dignity as standard have not yet seriously answered. There is a form of dignity that requires no audience. No one is watching, no one will remember, no record will be made of what happens here. And yet a person acts in a certain way, not because they will be praised for it, not because punishment follows the alternative, but because this is what a person of a certain kind does. This interior form is the hardest version of the concept to hold on to, and also the most revealing. It strips away every external prop and asks what remains. The observation seems small at first. A person alone makes a choice that costs something.
declines to take what they could take without detection, refuses to compromise in a way that would harm no visible party, maintains a standard that the situation offers no pressure to maintain. The act leaves no trace in the world. No one is served by it in any obvious sense, and yet it is not nothing. It is, in some compressed form, the whole question of what dignity actually is when separated from the conditions, social, relational, political, that normally carry it. What the observation expands toward is a structural principle about the relationship between dignity and witnessing. Most accounts of dignity, even the ones that insist on its interiority, are embedded in relational contexts. Kant's formulation that rational beings must be treated as ends is a claim directed outward, toward how others must behave toward you. The political frameworks protecting dignity depend on institutions, enforceable rights, bodies with the authority to intervene. Even the relational transmission of dignity that children depend on is, by definition, a transaction between persons. The social recognition account of dignity is entirely external in its mechanism. Nearly every operational form of dignity that matters legally, politically, practically, is witnessed in some sense, registered by another person, an institution, a legal record.
The interior form removes all of this. There is no institution present, no other person whose recognition is at stake, no framework to enforce or affirm what is happening. What remains is only the person and their own sense of what acting in accordance with who they are requires. This is not a simple thing. It is one of the most demanding moral positions available, precisely because it cannot borrow force from external sources. The person doing the unwitnessed act does not get the psychological support of being seen to be the kind of person who does such things. They only have the private knowledge, which is a thinner resource than it sounds. You can feel this in the inverse case. When a person does something that violates their own sense of what they should be, when no one else knows, when there will be no consequence, when the violation is entirely contained within their own experience, the feeling that follows is not nothing. It is a specific kind of self-knowledge, and it carries weight. Something has been registered, even without a witness. Whatever dignity is as a philosophical concept, its interior form has an experience attached to it. The experience of either holding or failing to hold something that matters in the absence of any external measure. Stress testing this principle reveals something important about where it holds and where it begins to show its limits. In ordinary conditions, when a life includes reasonable social recognition, when the basic structures that reflect dignity back to a person are present, the interior form is a supplement to other forms. It adds depth to a dignity that already has external support. A person who is treated with respect, who lives in conditions that acknowledge their personhood, who has relationships in which their voice registers. For that person, the unwitnessed act adds something, but rests on a foundation that already exists. The principle becomes most important precisely when that foundation is absent. This is where the Stoic insight recovers some of what makes it genuinely powerful. In conditions designed to strip every external marker of personhood, the interior form is what remains available. The person whose name has been replaced by a number, whose choices have been systematically removed, who has been made to perform submission in ways designed to dissolve the sense of being a subject. That person still has, in principle, access to some version of the interior form. The act that no one sees, maintained simply because it is what a person of a certain kind does, is in those conditions the only form of dignity that has not been taken. But the principle breaks here in a specific way. The capacity to sustain interior dignity across extended conditions of degradation is not equally distributed. It is not a matter of moral quality,
as if those who lose their grip on it were less serious about their own personhood than those who maintain it. It is a matter of what conditions do to the psyche over time. Prolonged humiliation, the afterlife of which was traced through earlier thinking, reshapes what a person believes they are allowed to claim, what standard of treatment they have come to feel they deserve. Interior dignity depends, at a minimum, on the person retaining some functional sense of themselves as a subject, some access to the feeling that their own judgments about their own life carry weight. When systematic degradation has suppressed that access, the interior form becomes unavailable, not because the person lacks it metaphysically, but because the psychological conditions for inhabiting it have been eroded.
This is the breakpoint. The principle holds under pressure. It is specifically designed for pressure. But there is a threshold, past which the pressure is no longer something the principle can simply absorb. The person on the other side of that threshold has not forfeited anything. They have been brought to a place where the resources the interior form requires are no longer accessible to them. The gap between possessing dignity as a philosophical status and being able to inhabit it as a living experience, the gap identified earlier as one of the deepest injuries one person can inflict on another, is exactly what the interior form encounters at its limit. What this means is that the interior form cannot serve as an excuse for failing to change conditions. The Stoic move becomes dangerous precisely when it is used to suggest that because dignity is available in principle, even in extreme conditions, the conditions themselves are therefore acceptable, or at least not philosophically urgent. The availability of interior dignity does not reduce the moral demand to create external conditions in which dignity can actually be lived rather than only notionally held. And then there is the question the principle cannot fully answer on its own terms. Can interior dignity be cultivated, developed through habit, attention, practice, or is it something that some people simply receive, a psychological disposition that arrives more or less formed? The philosophical tradition has not settled this. The Stoics believed it was largely a matter of discipline and reason, available to anyone willing to do the philosophical work. But the evidence about what conditions do to persons, about how badly the psychological ground of self-regard can be damaged and how difficult the repair is, suggests that the acquisition of interior dignity is not purely a matter of individual effort applied to neutral material. The ground has to be workable, and whether it is workable depends, at least in part, on what has happened to it. The question stays open. What the interior form reveals, in holding it up against its own limits, is that the hardest version of dignity is also the most fragile. Not metaphysically fragile, not structurally forfeitable, but practically vulnerable in ways that no philosophical formulation about its inalienability can simply cancel. The unwitnessed act that no one registers, performed simply because it is what a person of a certain kind does, is both the purest expression of what the concept means and the form that depends most completely on conditions it cannot itself guarantee. Every major tradition that has thought seriously about what persons are has arrived, by some path, at something that functions like dignity. The arrival is not accidental. The need the concept answers, the need to account for why persons are not simply objects to be used, why their suffering matters, why there is something that must not be done to them regardless of utility or cost, that need appears to be genuinely universal. What differs, profoundly and irreconcilably, is the ground on which each tradition builds its answer. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because the surface appearance is one of agreement. Look across the major religious and philosophical frameworks, and you find, in each of them, language about the special status of persons, about what must not be done to human beings, about a form of worth that is not earned and cannot be forfeited.
The appearance of convergence is real. The traditions are not simply talking past each other, they are orbiting the same problem. But orbit is not a rival. What looks like shared ground, examined more carefully, turns out to be a series of foundations that are genuinely different in their structure, their source, and what they demand. And those differences are not footnotes. They determine everything. In the Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, the ground of dignity is theological. The person has a status that cannot be removed because the person bears a relationship to God, created in the divine image, in the phrase that runs through Jewish and Christian thought, or as God's vicegerent on earth in the Quranic account. This ground gives dignity enormous force. It is not contingent on what the person has done, what they can do, or what others think of them. The status comes from outside the human order entirely, which means no human decision can finally revoke it. The person who has been reduced to nothing in social and political terms still stands in a relationship to the source of all value that no one else controls. This is a genuinely powerful structure. It answers the question of why dignity is inalienable by pointing to a relationship that transcends every human power. And it does so in a way that carries existential weight, not as an abstraction, but as something a person can hold on to, can live inside, even in extreme conditions.
The problem the theological ground creates is not one you can resolve by adjusting the formulation. The ground holds only if the foundational claim holds. If a person does not share the theological framework, if the relationship to God is not part of how they understand themselves or the world, then the ground does not transfer. The dignity it underwrites is real within the tradition, but the tradition cannot compel the ground to those outside it. This is not a failure of the tradition, it is a feature of what theological grounding means. It roots dignity in something ultimate, which gives it its strength. But that ultimate is not available to everyone as a shared starting point. The Hindu and Buddhist traditions approach something like dignity through structurally different means. In the Hindu framework, the soul, the Atman, carries a status that persists across lifetimes, which produces something analogous to dignity, though the caste structure historically complicated this enormously. The metaphysical equality of souls coexisted with a social order that emphatically did not treat persons as equals. The tension between the metaphysical claim and the social reality was not merely hypocrisy. It reflected a genuine internal problem about where dignity operates and who has access to it in any given life. Buddhism, which rejected the Atman, grounds its analogous concept differently, in the capacity for suffering, in the potential for awakening present in all sentient beings. The Buddha nature doctrine in certain traditions holds that all beings carry within them the seed of liberation. What this produces is something like dignity, grounded in potential and shared vulnerability, rather than in a fixed soul or a divine relationship. What the Buddhist case makes visible when you press it is that grounding dignity in sentience and suffering, rather than in rationality or divine status, has consequences for the boundary of the concept. It pushes the line of moral consideration outward, toward animals, toward forms of life that the Western traditions centered on rational personhood have mostly excluded. This is not a peripheral implication. It is a direct consequence of the grounding choice, and it produces a genuinely different picture of who and what possesses something like dignity. The boundary of the concept is set by what the foundation requires, and different foundations draw different boundaries. The Confucian tradition locates something like dignity in the cultivation of virtue, and in the relational web of social roles fulfilled with integrity. This is closer to what the ancient Western sense of dignitas meant, something that has to be lived into rather than simply possessed by birthright. The Confucian framework is not primarily about inherent status,
but about what a person becomes through practice, through the proper ordering of relationships, through the cultivation of humanity, benevolence. This produces a concept that is more dynamic than the inalienable status version. It depends on what a person does with their nature, how they inhabit their roles, whether they bring integrity to their relationships. Its strength is that it connects dignity to the actual texture of how a life is lived. Its problem is that it is more vulnerable to the charge that dignity can be more or less fully realized, which creates the question of whether those who have not cultivated it, or who live in conditions that prevent its cultivation, possess it in any meaningful sense. The Enlightenment secular tradition, most powerfully expressed through Kant, tried to find a ground that would work without theology, a ground internal to the rational structure of persons themselves. Rational nature, the capacity to set one's own ends and to act according to principles, is the source of a worth that is unconditional and incomparable. This is a genuinely philosophical move. It does not rely on a deity, a soul, or a social role, but on something that the person is as a rational being. Its universality is intended to be demonstrable rather than confessional, available to anyone who follows the argument. And Kant's formulation of dignity as the feature of persons that prohibits their reduction to mere means has become the most influential secular account of the concept in modern ethics and law. The complications of the Kantian ground are familiar from earlier thought in this episode. What about persons whose rational capacity is absent or severely diminished? What grounds their dignity on this account? Kant himself does not give a fully satisfying answer, and his successors have proposed various extensions and modifications, some grounding dignity in the capacity for rational development, some in membership in the moral community, some in something like vulnerability or sentience that runs alongside rationality. Each extension solves one problem and creates another. The Kantian framework is extraordinarily productive, but it is not finished. The ground keeps requiring supplementation. What emerges from holding these traditions alongside each other is not a synthesis. It is a map of irreconcilable foundations that nevertheless point at the same need. Each tradition arrives at dignity because something about human experience, the experience of violation, the experience of being used, the experience of what it costs to be seen as nothing, demands an accounting. The concept is the answer every tradition has reached for when confronted with that demand. But the answer is given differently each time, and the differences are not trivial variations on a shared theme. They determine who counts, what grounds the status, what it demands of others, and whether it can be lost. The universality of the need and the irreconcilability of the foundations exist simultaneously, without cancelling each other. The need is genuine. The agreements about it are real as far as they go. But underneath the apparent consensus, the arguments are ongoing, between traditions and within them. What each tradition is actually protecting when it protects dignity, and what it leaves exposed, depends on where it chose to stand when it answered the question of what persons are and why that matters. Those answers are not converging, they are deepening. Dignity is doing enormous work in the contemporary world, work that is concrete, institutional, and legally binding. It appears in national constitutions, in the foundational documents of international law, in the ethical frameworks governing medicine, research, and the treatment of prisoners. Courts invoke it when striking down laws. Bioethicists invoke it when determining what can and cannot be done to a human body. Human rights declarations place it at the center of their architecture, as the concept from which the specific rights are said to flow. The word carries legal weight. Decisions rest on it. People are protected or failed on the basis of how it is interpreted, by institutions with real authority over real lives.
And yet, the concept doing all of this work remains philosophically unsettled at every level that matters. The source of dignity, where it comes from, what generates it, why persons possess it rather than simply being objects among objects, has not been agreed upon. The scope of dignity, who counts as a bearer of it, whether the category has edges, what happens at those edges, remains actively contested. The content of dignity, what it actually prohibits, what it actually requires, how it resolves when it conflicts with other values, is the subject of ongoing disagreement among philosophers, jurists, theologians, and anyone who has thought carefully about a specific hard case. This is not a situation where the philosophy lags behind the law and will eventually catch up. The instability is permanent. The concept will not settle. The gap between the legal authority of dignity and its philosophical instability is worth holding still for a moment, because it is easy to mistake it for a technical problem. The temptation is to frame it as a gap that further refinement will close, more precise definitions, more careful jurisprudence, a better foundational theory. But the instability does not arise from imprecision. It arises from something structural in what dignity is being asked to do. A civilization that decides it cannot live without a value, that organizes its legal and political architecture around that value, that treats it as foundational rather than derived, has in that very move placed the value beyond the reach of ordinary philosophical revision. You cannot simply correct the concept of dignity the way you might correct a scientific hypothesis. The institutions built on it, the expectations held under it, the protections that depend on it, all of these create a form of commitment that outpaces any philosophical verdict on whether the grounding is sound. The value becomes load-bearing before the question of what it rests on has been answered. And then the question of what it rests on must be answered, if at all, while the weight is already there. This is the situation dignity has been in for at least 2 centuries, and it is not easing. The pressure on the concept increases as new cases arrive, cases the original formulations were not designed to handle, cases that arise from technologies, from expanded moral consideration, from conflicts between rights that were not imagined as being in tension. Each new case requires an interpretation of dignity. Each interpretation reveals something about the contested foundations. Each revelation reopens arguments that the institutional framework needs to treat as settled in order to function. The law requires decisions. Philosophy requires that decisions be held open. Dignity is the site where those 2 requirements collide continuously. A person in a hospital room facing a question about what will happen to their body at the end of their life is not experiencing an abstract philosophical problem. The question of what dignity requires in that room is immediate and consequential. And yet, the answer given by the institution, by the legal framework, by the medical ethics board, that answer rests on an interpretation of dignity whose foundations the philosophers have not agreed on, and whose content in this specific case is genuinely disputed. What the institution provides is a decision, not a resolution. The decision has force, the resolution remains open. The same structure appears in questions about what can be done to persons in detention, about what research on human subjects is permissible, about what a state owes to its citizens in conditions of emergency, about whether the dignity of future generations places constraints on what present generations may do. In each domain, dignity is the concept that is supposed to anchor the answer. In each domain, the anchoring reveals that the concept itself has not been secured. The anchor holds in practice, institutions function, decisions are made, people are protected or not protected, but the chain connecting the anchor to the seabed of philosophical justification
is longer and less certain than the institutional language suggests. This is not a reason to distrust the protection's dignity under rights. The protections are real, and their removal would cause real harm. But there is a difference between trusting the protections and believing the grounding is complete. The value of dignity as a legal and political concept does not depend on resolving the philosophical dispute about its foundations. It depends on the dispute remaining live enough that the concept keeps being pressed, keeps being tested against new cases, keeps being refused the comfort of a settled definition that would allow it to harden into ideology. When dignity stops being pressed, when it is repeated as a formula rather than interrogated as a claim, it becomes available for uses that have nothing to do with protecting persons. Dignity invoked as formula can be used to deny, to exclude, to override the expressed wishes of the very people whose dignity is supposedly at stake. The concept's protective force comes precisely from its instability, from the fact that it cannot be reduced to a simple rule that applies without judgment. Every application requires interpretation. Every interpretation requires a return to the contested foundations. The instability is the mechanism that keeps the concept honest. There is something that follows from this for how you hold the concept personally, not as a legal or political matter, but as a question about your own situation. If dignity's foundations are philosophically unsettled, if the most rigorous accounts of it remain incomplete, if civilizations have organized themselves around it without resolving what it is, then you are in the same position as every philosopher, jurist, and political thinker who has engaged with it seriously. You are working with a concept that you cannot fully ground, that you cannot derive from first principles that everyone accepts, that will not give you clean answers in hard cases. And yet the concept is doing work in your life as surely as it is doing work in constitutional courts. The decisions you make about how to treat others, about what you owe and are owed, about what cannot be accepted, even when accepting it would be easier, those decisions invoke dignity, whether or not you use the word.
The permanent condition of a value a civilization cannot live without is that it must be carried without being solved. The people who carry it, who invoke it in legal arguments, who depend on it in conditions of vulnerability, who extend it across lines of difference at some personal cost, are not waiting for the philosophy to finish. They are acting under the concept before the concept is complete. They have always been doing this. The philosophical work and the practical work proceed simultaneously, neither waiting for the other, neither capable of substituting for the other. What this means for the concept itself is that dignity's authority in the world does not come from the certainty of its foundations. It comes from the seriousness with which each generation has refused to let the question close. The moment dignity is treated as answered, its source confirmed, its scope fixed, its content fully specified, it begins to lose the quality that makes it do philosophical work rather than simply decorative work. The living concept is the contested one. What has never been fully resolved has never been fully captured. So the question that has been held open through all of this, if dignity cannot be taken, what is it that is lost when it is taken, does not resolve into an answer. It resolves into a different kind of seeing. What is lost is not dignity itself. Dignity, in its most defensible sense, persists. It is there in the person whose name has been replaced by a number, in the person whose choices have been reduced to nothing, in the person who has been made to perform their own submission before others. The metaphysical claim holds, or at least it holds as well as it ever has, which is to say, it holds to the degree that you are willing to press the foundations and find that nothing disproves it decisively. Dignity is not extracted, it is not dissolved, but something is lost, something real, something that causes lasting harm,
something that takes years and sometimes lifetimes to recover, and sometimes never recovers. What is lost is the ability to inhabit it. That phrase deserves a moment. To inhabit something is different from possessing it. You can own a house and be locked out of it. The house remains yours in some formal sense. You have been displaced from your own. This is close to what humiliation accomplishes. The dignity is there, has always been there, will continue to be there in the philosophical structure that underlies personhood, but the person's access to it, their capacity to feel it as real, to act from it, to draw on it when facing what cannot be accepted, that capacity has been damaged. The gap between owning dignity and being able to live inside it is exactly the gap that violence, humiliation, and chronic disregard create. And it is a real gap. Its reality is not cancelled by the theoretical persistence of what was never taken. This is where the threads that have run through all of this converge without merging into a single thing.
The relational dimension of dignity. The fact that children do not arrive knowing they possess it, that someone must reflect it back for it to become psychologically real. This is not just a developmental observation. It is a structural feature of the concept that persists into adult life. Even an adult who has inhabited their dignity for years can have that inhabitation disrupted by sustained treatment that contradicts it. The philosophical fact of inalienability does not protect the living experience of dignity from erosion. What restores it, or makes it possible in the first place, is being met by others who recognize it. This is not a soft point about kindness. It is a precise claim about what makes a metaphysical possession livable rather than merely theoretical. The interior dimension, dignity without witnesses, the act done privately with no audience, no record, no reward, simply because a person of a certain kind does it. This is the form most resistant to displacement. It is also the form that is hardest to maintain, precisely because it requires a relationship with yourself that sustained humiliation is designed to corrode. The regimes that strip names and require public submission understand something very specific. They are trying to sever the person from their own interior. When that severance succeeds, it does not destroy the dignity. It displaces the person from it. The interior form of dignity is both the most protected and the most targeted, because it is the last thing that must be broken before a person becomes unable to act from what they are. The active dimension, dignity as claim, not just possession, something that asks you to refuse what degrades it, even when refusal is costly. This is where dignity makes its most uncomfortable demand. It is the demand that you do not betray yourself when no one else has. It is the demand that you extend recognition to others across the line of fear or contempt, knowing that the extension costs something. Knowing that the mechanisms inside you that resist it are not aberrations, but deeply human responses that every society has cultivated at some point to make exclusion feel reasonable. The active claim of dignity is not a feeling. It is a decision made in the face of everything that makes the other decision easier. These three, the relational, the interior, the active, are not separate kinds of dignity. They are the same thing, seen from different pressures. Together, they describe what it means to inhabit the concept rather than merely possess it. And the inhabiting is never finished, never secured for good, never exempt from disruption. The person who has fully inhabited their dignity and extended it reliably across every line of difference has not arrived at a permanent state. They have built a practice, and practices can be disrupted, abandoned, lost, and resumed. What this means, at the end of a long investigation into something that has no final answer,
is that the question is alive in you, in a way that has nothing to do with philosophy as a discipline. Every time you treat someone's distress as worth responding to, you are performing the relational act that makes dignity real, rather than theoretical. Every time you do something with integrity when no one is watching, you are holding the interior form that is hardest to hold. Every time you extend recognition across the point where recognition is difficult, across fear, across difference, across the full weight of reasons not to, you are doing the thing on which every coherent account of universal human dignity depends.
The concept will not settle. The foundations will not be agreed upon. The pressure of new cases will keep pressing the interpretations. This is not a failure of thinking. It is the sign that the concept is still alive, still being carried, still doing real work, rather than merely decorative work. What has never been fully resolved has never been fully captured, and what has never been fully captured can never be fully discarded. You have dignity, not only as a philosophical claim that has been made on your behalf by traditions and legal frameworks and documents. You have it as something you can, in some meaningful sense, choose to inhabit, or fail to inhabit, in the texture of how you move through a life. That is its weight. It is also, if you hold it right, something like its freedom. Good night.